Just when you thought you actually knew everything about Barack Obama and every conceivable thing you could possibly know about the longest presidential campaign in the history of presidential campaigns, none other than Richard Wolffe, political analyst for MSNBC and former White House correspondent for Newsweek, writes a brand new book called Renegade, The Making of a President. And the amazing thing about this book is that there's lots of stuff in there that you didn't know, much of which is really interesting. The book has been embargoed until yesterday, so now the details are slowly seeping out. And Richard Wolffe joins us. Richard, thank you for being with us again.
My pleasure, Ron. It's great to be with you again.
Well, look, let's just start out. First question, one of the things that has always impressed everybody about Barack Obama is his utter and total self-confidence in himself, his direction, his campaign. Though his detractors call it arrogance, his supporters call it, self-confidence. Was he this confident when he launched his campaign?
No, he wasn't. And it's easy to look back and say, everything was successful and planned out. Well, he didn't think that he was going to run this time around. In fact, as he began discussing it, his senior advisors were convinced he wasn't going to do it. David Plouffe, right until the last moment, I'm sure you got plenty of emails from David Plouffe, he was convinced that this guy was not going to pull the trigger. And, of course, he did run, but that first year on the campaign through 2007, it was rough. He hated being a candidate. He found it a very hard adjustment. He had disputes with his inner circle and with his donors and with everyone else. This was not a smooth process, but he studied, he worked at it, he improved himself, he made himself, he willed himself into a better candidate.
Why was he so hesitant at the beginning? Because none of that came out from the moment of his announcement all the way up through his acceptance speech. None of it came out.
It wouldn't have been a good launch, would it?
No.
I think I'm going to run for president, but I'm not so convinced. Why was he hesitant? Well, he was hesitant for a number of reasons. First of all, the toll on his family, something Michelle Obama wanted to know very early on. Would he get weekends off? And they said, no. Are you kidding? So being away from his family, even more away than he already was, living in Washington and the family being in Chicago, the public scrutiny piece of it, which I don't think even with all his pre-decision discussions really fully understood. He once told one of his friends that it was like a public colonoscopy. He wasn't ready for that. And I think the third piece of it, which Michelle Obama really wanted to know, look, they knew it was an election where change was important, and that's when they thought, well, that's our best opening because we represent more change than anyone else. But they didn't know that they had a strategy to win, whether they'd have the money, whether they could go from state to state, whether he could get known. One of his friends told me it was like a virus almost, a social virus. He needed to have time to be spread around, for people to get to know the name and the person. And if he had enough time, he could do this. But time was key, and some people said, well, maybe he should have surprised Clinton and not declared so early and come in later in the year. The real answer to that is he needed the whole of 2007 to get better as a candidate, to get better known, to build that thing that he created in Iowa, and then spring it on the rest of the country. But and most of all, he needed the time to raise the money to be able to move on from Iowa. So none of this was obvious.
Okay, well, one of the things that was a wedge point throughout the campaign, both against Hillary and ultimately against John McCain, was his statement in the debate that he would be willing, without preconditions, to meet with foreign leaders. And that, of course, created a huge kerfuffle, a certain amount of qualification as to what preconditions really meant or didn't mean. But he had this huge coterie of advisors on foreign policy, many of them, exceptionally bright human beings. Was it a strategy they had planned, or did this just sort of pop out?
He popped it out. It was totally unplanned and unscripted. And they were prepared afterwards to dial it back, to say, what he really meant was... And there was this call afterwards where they were discussing about how they would dial it back, and he was on the call, and he just interrupts and says, listen, guys, I meant what I said. we're going to do this, and everything else is just conventional Washington politics. We've got to do things differently. And that was a real teaching moment for the campaign, where they realized, A, he would stick to his guns, and B, that there was this track for them to be a different kind of campaign. It wasn't just a bunch of slogans. He was going to try and do things differently.
Right, but what about the notion of just sort of telling your aides and your senior foreign policy advisors before you articulate it on national television? I mean, I get the notion that that's what he wanted to do, but why didn't he tip anybody off?
Here's the thing. He actually didn't prep for his debates. He was a bad debater.
Yeah.
He thought these TV debates were stupid. They were kind of beneath him. He didn't work at them. And it wasn't until the general election that he really started to wrestle it to the ground and figure out his message and his policies and how he would debate and his debate tactics. He didn't have any tactics going into these things. He told me that, look, his general way of dealing with a group discussion was to try and find common ground and synthesize different people's opinions and bring everyone together. That's exactly the opposite of what you want to do in a debate. You want to be a trial lawyer. You want to go and savage someone and rip out their jugular. He wouldn't do it. He couldn't do it. And I don't even think he could do it in the general election, but at least he knew what he was trying to do. In those primary debates, he was very poor, and he knew it, and they knew it. Took him a long time to get better.
Right. Of course, the perception that we grew into, some of us sooner than later, was that his poor performance in the debates really reflected who he actually was, a consensus builder, a thinker, and not a slash and burn kind of guy. And over time, I think America sort of decided we wanted that.
I think that's true. I think they did want someone who was willing to think out loud and speak in a different kind of way, someone who was taking, to use a word that was so disdained in 2004, to engage in some nuance, because this turned out to be a much more complex world than George Bush and maybe lots of other people realized. So I think that a certain wonkishness and seriousness appealed to voters at a very serious time. Having said that, he still needed to be a conventional politician. He could be a renegade, but he needed to be a renegade who could also play by the rules when he needed them to win. And so he needed to get the TV debates nailed down before the general election, and that was an important bar he crossed at that moment. He sealed the deal in the debates.
Now, the other thing that came up in the course of the primaries that appeared to be ready to derail his campaign was the Jeremiah Wright tape came out, and Obama originally defended Wright with a very nuanced speech about race. Then Wright started talking some more, always a bad idea, and very quickly he was thrown underneath the bus.
He was, but not before Obama reached out to him for a secret meeting where he said, he went round to his house and said, don't do this. This is going to be bad. You may be a preacher and you may feel that you've been under attack, but I know how things work in the age of blogs and cable TV, and you're headed for vilification, not vindication. Wright stuck to his guns and proved himself to be wrong. You know, he was vilified, and he deserved it. And Obama was angry with him. He thought he was selfish and disloyal, and to be honest, they thought actually he had sunk the campaign. They feared the worst because before the Indiana primaries, the next contest, their numbers collapsed. They thought Wright had effectively sunk their nomination and 2 years of work, and they were proved wrong too.
Did he make any similar reach out to Billy Ayers, who was, in interest of full disclosure, is a friend of mine, who absolutely kept his mouth shut until the election was over? Was there a similar overture, directly or indirectly, to him, like "Don't open your mouth, Bill"?
I don't believe there was, and you know, he obviously wasn't the same kind of issue or problem, and he did keep his head down. Even though as he was drawing all that fire. Here's the thing. On Election Day itself, and I start the book out with this, at the local polling station where Obama and his family voted, on Election Day, November 4th, who should be standing in line to vote before the president walks in? Bill Ayers, and he said that Bill Ayers was just a guy in the neighborhood, and everyone went, "Oh yeah,
Yeah.
he was a guy in the neighborhood."
Right.